Hello. Welcome to listen to the debate, Time to Update the Treaties for a Stronger and Larger EU. The parties to the debate will exchange ideas on the enlargement of the EU, a topic that arouses a lot of emotions. The debate is hosted by the Union of European Federalists. You can join the conversation in chat via the QR code on the screen. Welcome.
Thank you, and warm welcome also from my side. My name is Kati Sista. I'm a board member of Young European Federalists, also known as Jeff Europe. I'm really happy that we're having this exchange and discussion today. The enlargement of the European Union is a hot topic that raises a lot of questions and also a lot of emotions. Yet it is a significant question for the future of our entire union and our continent. After Russia launched the full-scale attack against Ukraine in 2022, the expansion of the Union has risen into the heart of European discussions. How should the EU change to prepare to welcome the new members? From a federalist perspective, we say that you can't have your cake and eat it too. If we want to welcome new countries into our union, we cannot really say no to reforming our union. The European Parliament President Roberta Metsola has yesterday urged EU reform to cope with this enlargement. We as federalists, of course, support the enlargement and want to see a clear path for countries to join our union. At the same time, we see that our union is not ready to welcome them, and we want to be able to include them in our decision-making and structures in a way that makes sense and is meaningful for them and us. The current debate on European level is very much about how and when are we opening the treaties, whilst in Finland we are often still discussing whether or not we should open them. So maybe a controversial hot take. Do we also want to be, again, left out of the big European discussions if we are stuck? This is also why we are discussing this here today, and we will hopefully also come up with solutions and ideas. The chat wall, as mentioned, is open for questions from the public, which we will hopefully be able to take towards the end of the discussion, so feel free to submit them. And now we will hear the perspectives of the former Finnish Prime Minister, Paavo Lipponen, and the Senior Research Fellow from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Manuel Müller. Welcome. I will give the floor first to Mr. Paavo Lipponen.
Thank you. Thank you for the good news about Roberta Metsola. Maybe there's some Finnish wisdom behind it. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome all federalists and particularly anti-federalists. For me, it's a kind of a déjà vu experience following the debate, the little there is, on the future of the European Union. I was 3 times involved in intergovernmental conferences, and then in a convention. That was my initiative that discussed these questions. Each time we were preparing the Union for another enlargement by changing, making treaty changes. This time we find ourselves in a similar situation, but there's no debate. Annika Ström, an experienced EU journalist, wrote in Dagens Nyheter on the eve of the European election, a few days before the election day, and I quote, "It is extremely worrying that there is no debate on the most important question. That is how to secure EU's decision-making capability after enlargement." The difference between previous and today's situation is in its seriousness. This time the Union is at a critical, even existential turning point. Are we able to do what it takes to strengthen the European Union in every way? Economically, environmentally, militarily, and so on. But above all, can we gather enough political will to make the necessary treaty changes for a union of over 30 members? Now, I must admit that I'm not too well versed in all the very bureaucratic processes where we stand and in the European Union in this process, but I dare give a few opinions. I'm aware of the important Commission communication in March this year on pre-enlargement reforms and policy reviews. This document and the European debate is weighted in favor of enlargement. Well, it's quite natural. As such, just recognizing various problems lacking any vision about institutional development. As Annika Ström wrote it in her article, there is a multitude of questions being thrown up in the election debate that were commented, but not the most important question. The Commission is due to give at the beginning of 2025 a more thorough assessment of enlargement, followed by sectoral reports and a multi-year financing framework proposal, and this by next summer. Now back to the déjà vu. It is about the doctrinal question, enlargement versus deepening. I was arguing in my time that further deepening of integration is a prerequisite for any major enlargement, whereas my president and foreign minister thought only enlargement is important. It was a bit absurd. Deepening was actually a central question at the intergovernmental conferences, and pragmatically, my government wanted each time to increase qualified majority decision-making. So in that way, actually, I had a mandate. We had a mandate to deepen integration. Once in Nice, 2000, the terrible conference summit, we played a central role. I'll take an example. So we were forcing against France. Chirac was adamantly against an extension of QMV to trade with services. Erkki Tuomioja, Antti Satuli, and Jari Luoto did a great job. And a young foreign ministry diplomat, Alexander Stubb, contributed. The Commission, in its document, underlines that existing treaties do allow the European Council to decide to extend QMV to several fields, should there be the political will to do so. In foreign policy, even tax and social policies, energy and climate. Commission rightly indicates that QMV can be applied to deepening cooperation in justice and home affairs that we actually introduced a new chapter at Tampere in 1999, and to create a permanent structural cooperation framework for defense cooperation. So that's already indicates something where we can go longer. I'll come back to that. Now, where does Finland stand on the fundamental problem of enlarging versus deepening? For treaty changes, the government is paralyzed by the true Finns' resistance. But Finland is working with some like-minded countries to trying to find ways to exploit the existing treaties for the kind of QMV extensions I mentioned. So let us wish good luck to Prime Minister Orpo in this effort while waiting for the major awakening that Europe needs to pull its act together. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I may sound a bit resigned because we are facing a kind of indifference among the political elite in our parliament, Europe-wise. So it's kind of a taboo to touch these fundamental questions. But the European Union cannot survive without deepening of integration. And with enlargement in sight, with countries like Ukraine, I mean, that Ukraine could be member 2030. We know that it won't work on the basis of the present structures. So what is likely to happen is a development towards, as in the 80s, it was talked about Europe de vitesse. That is, like in the EMU, particularly defense, so-called structural cooperation will happen because the major big countries will take care of this. But even this is something that I'm blaming mainly Germany and France. There is no vision, no drive to really discuss this. So going back to the European election, there's no mandate to do anything. At least the Finnish government has no mandate. So thank you for inviting me to speak on these questions. Hopefully, because of the seriousness of the challenges we are facing, we can do something about these basic questions, because now the debate is, I mean, everybody wants to make the union stronger in defense. Everybody wants to work on the environment and so on. But to really get things done, we need treaty changes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will give the floor from Mr. Muller to comments.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you also to Paavo Lipponen. I think you mentioned a very, very crucial aspect here with this kind of traditional fundamental contraposition of deepening and enlargement. And I think that part of the problem in the public debate is that the reasons for enlargement are right now very clear to everybody. There are clear and compelling geopolitical reasons why the European Union needs enlargement, especially towards Ukraine, but also towards the Western Balkans. And I think maybe it's still not as clear in the public debate often why deepening is also necessary right now and very urgently. So I think maybe I would like to add a few thoughts about why deepening matters right now. And part of this is directly linked to the enlargement question, but a very important part of this is also true completely independently on whether the EU is going to enlarge or not. And the main reason, in my view, is that the EU is, from its institutional structure, fundamentally ill-prepared to the crises that are going to come in the coming years. And part of this, well, there is a long debate going on already about the poly-crisis or the perma-crisis, as it's called today, so the fact that over the last decade or so, the EU has continuously been confronted with different forms of crisis that were influencing each other. And it is becoming very clear that this is not going to end anytime soon. So this argument that has often been heard that, well, we have now so many crises at hand, let's just solve them and then talk about future institutional reforms, doesn't work anymore because we cannot expect the crisis to end. It's rather on the contrary, we have to reform the European Union in order to be prepared for the crisis to come. These crises include, of course, climate change, which will come, and it will be, well, it will have a great impact. It includes geopolitical challenges. It includes, of course, migration, which will also increase, also partly because of climate change. It includes pandemics, which will become more likely in the future. So there are many things to which the European Union will have to react, and it will have to be able to react quickly because we cannot foresee all these crises. They will come and surprise us. And right now, the EU decision-making procedures are simply extremely cumbersome, extremely inefficient, extremely slow, even when everybody is cooperating. And of course, we have seen over the past years that we cannot expect every member state to cooperate, that we have to assume also bad faith by some actors within the European Union, so we have to be prepared also for that. So this is one of the reasons why institutional reform is necessary in order to make the EU more efficient, more capable to act. Then, of course, there is the other aspect of democratization and making the EU more democratic. In a Eurobarometer of last year, I think, more than half of the European citizens answered that they had the feeling that their voice didn't count at the European level. And this is still a terribly high proportion, and it is much higher than at the national level. So this issue of making the EU more responsive to citizens, of making European Parliament elections more meaningful, of giving European political parties more of a role in shaping policy, is something that will be necessary also in order to maintain the democratic legitimacy and the acceptance of the European Union, especially in a time when the European Union will have to become more efficient and will have to get more power in order to deal with these crises. So the issue of efficiency and the issue of democracy in the end are linked to each other, because you cannot have a powerful European Union that needs to be able to also overrule individual member states in some cases without having also a solid democratic basis for the European Union. And then, of course, a third aspect, unfortunately, is the rule of law crisis and the value crisis that we have seen unfolding in the European Union over the last decade. I mentioned it before, we cannot expect every actor in the European Union to act in good faith. We have seen governments that have gone on a clearly autocratic path. so we need the European institutions to be resilient to this kind of attacks from anti-democratic actors. And that also implies, for example, not giving a veto right to every single government, because sometimes it may just be necessary to outvote governments. So all of this is kind of independent from enlargement. These are reforms that we need no matter what. And now we also have enlargement, which means that we will have even more actors playing a role at the European scene, which means that European politics is going to become even more complicated, that it will be even more difficult to find a consensus on matters and so on. So enlargement is necessary, but it will also exacerbate all of these institutional problems that we already have. So it is necessary, when we are having this debate about enlargement, to also have a debate about institutional reforms. And it may be necessary to have this debate about institutional reforms actually before enlargement, because we already now have a huge problem of reformability in the European Union. We are basically talking about institutional reforms for 10 or 15 years now, more or less since the Euro crisis. And there have been treaties like the Fiscal Compact, where European member states committed to have a treaty reform by 2017, 2018 or something. So there was a clear plan to open the treaties again, and then it wasn't possible because of all the current crises at hand, and because it was clear that some member state would veto a reform and so on. So we already now have this big problem that we know that we need reforms, but we don't actually know how we are going to implement them, because the reform procedure as such is so difficult. And of course, this problem too will just become bigger with enlargement. So if we are not able to reform the European Union now, when we have a clear reason to do so, because we know that we want enlargement and that we need enlargement quickly. So if we are not able to reform the European Union now quickly, it will become even more difficult later. And the perma-crisis, climate change, and so on, as I mentioned before, is not going to go away. Everything will just become more difficult because we will be more member states. And again, all of this is not an argument against enlargement, because enlargement is necessary. It is an argument to deal with institutional reform as quickly as possible. So the best solution probably would be to have a convention now, as quickly as possible, to open the treaties. There are many institutional reforms, of course, that do not require treaty change, but a convention is also useful because of other reasons, because any institutional reform will be a very big and very complicated thing, and a lot of compromises will be necessary among member states, among institutional actors, and so on. So it is useful to have one place where we can discuss all these issues. Whether they require treaty change or not, a convention would be the place where European leaders mostly will come together and discuss about these necessary compromises. If we try to deal with every reform one by one and always try to find like the minimal solution, it will only become more difficult, because it will mean to have more debates at the same time. It will overwhelm national administrations even more than having one convention in one place. And I'm a bit worried that we will not be able to have this convention, that the political will won't be there as quickly as necessary, which would probably mean that we will have some kind of minimal reform before enlargement, that there are some things that absolutely need to happen. For example, we need a new distribution of the national seat quotas in the European Parliament. We cannot have enlargement without redistributing the seats, because otherwise the European Parliament would become too big for the treaties. So there will need to be some reforms in any case, but my worry is that it will just be a minimal reform before enlargement, and then things will become more complicated afterwards, and then we will get what Paavo Lipponen mentioned earlier, this Europe à deux vitesses, or this differentiated Europe. And then again, there will be like two options. There could be like a controlled, organized process towards a differentiated Europe, where you talk, for example, about different levels of participation, where there would be a core and then maybe one or two rings of peripheries and so on. So there could be a structure and differentiation, but in order to have a structured differentiation, you also need treaty reform, because you would need a treaty where you define these different layers. And if we are not able to get a treaty reform, then unfortunately the most likely scenario is that there will be some sort of uncontrolled and chaotic differentiation, which would probably mean more ad hoc coalitions of the willing among member states, which would probably mean that the European Parliament, the European Commission would lose influence because groups of national governments would just take things into their own hands and would act because they would say, well, we need to find a solution to this crisis at hand. We cannot wait for the others. And this, in the end, is something that would lead to institutional erosion on the one side, especially for the supranational institutions, but would also be bad for the relations between the different member states. Because in a world of coalitions of the willing, in a world that is very intergovernmental, it will be the most powerful member states that are going to take the lead. And it will mean that smaller member states will have to follow because they will not be able to kind of influence European policy in the same way as they could with functioning supranational institutions. So in the end, this kind of scenario of chaotic differentiation is probably the one that we will get without institutional reforms, and it is not one that we should wish for the future of the European Union.
Thank you so much for outlining your perspectives on the topic of today. Now it's time to go into the questions from the audience. So feel free to still submit. If you have any, we have just about 18 minutes to discuss some of them. I will go ahead and take the turn first. Something that I was thinking, listening to both of your speeches. Paavo Lipponen, you mentioned that fundamental questions of the future of the EU are found as uninteresting or almost like taboo for our current political elite and the member states' leadership. Ursula von der Leyen, the current Commission President, on the other hand, has mentioned when elected Commission President that she wants to see a reform agenda of the European Union and wants to work together with the European Parliament to do this. So my question is, how do you see von der Leyen's mandate or possibility to bring about this reform or bring it forward at least? And can we get the member states on board and get them envisioning the future of our union in this day and age?
Well, in my time, we defended the Commission as an institution versus intergovernmentalism, domination of the Council. There has to be, of course, balance. The community method must function. We succeeded in defending, because big countries, particularly France, wanted a thorough reform of the so-called reform of the communist by reducing number of members and so on. And even today, as really the Commission is the institution that gives hope, and there's real dynamism in von der Leyen's appearances. But we have to remember that it's the member states that will decide on any major institutional reform. So it's going to be a pragmatic process with QMV additions and so on. But to have the kind of development that Dr. Miller also was talking about, we need the political will, and that's lacking in major member countries particularly. The taboo thing is that leaders don't dare to speak, and the further you go along on this kind of line, the more difficult it becomes, as Dr. Miller said. So where do we get there's no sense of urgency in the Union. We need to create it, and of course it's fundamentally important that the citizens are aboard in this, the question of legitimacy. But even there we have failed. In Finland we have failed to tackle the onslaught of the kind of movements like the True Finns. And here we are. So I hope we'll see young people who take the lead in Finland.
Yeah, maybe I could also comment on the role of Germany and France, because, of course, they are both rather favorable towards reforms. And there has been this German-French expert group who last year presented the proposals for reform. Of course, these were not they had been nominated by the national governments. The national governments also made clear that these were independent experts. So it was not an official German and French position, but it was also quite close to the thinking, I think, in Berlin and Paris. And they were actually quite friendly towards reform. The problem, I think, with Germany and France is that they feel that there are too many member states who do not want reform. So they are basically afraid of a showdown between the member states that are favorable to reform and the member states who would block it and say we can have enlargement without reform, because they are afraid that this would kind of split the union. And of course, the problem of trying to avoid this conflict is that waiting doesn't help, and that if we do not seek reform, it will not come, and it will not be able to convince other member states that reform is necessary if we do not have this conversation. In general, I think Germany and France right now are focused on keeping the union together. So when talking about differentiation, it's something that especially Germany likes to avoid. Germany prefers to have the union as a whole and would like to kind of convince all member states that reforms are useful. And there again, they are kind of afraid of talking too openly about differentiation in order to avoid that this becomes something self-fulfilling. Because the moment that you say, okay, we are going to talk about how differentiation could look like, there is a risk that everybody is only going to focus on that rather than on the reforms that are necessary in the first place, and that might be the reason for differentiation. But again, there is this problem: if we do not talk about how differentiation could look like, there is a risk that in the end we will get this chaotic differentiation, that we will not get a differentiation that actually works, but like the worst of all worlds. And I think this is something where, Germany and France are not showing like the full potential of the leadership that they could, because they are a bit afraid that they might put things into motion that then do not end at the place where they want it to end. But of course, well, if there is no leadership, that doesn't help either. And the Commission might help. I think Ursula von der Leyen is prioritizing enlargement over reform. There is a certain fear that conflict about reform could then also compromise the enlargement debate, and that in the end we will get neither reform nor enlargement. But there again, this kind of this fear of having these conversations, the fear of having the necessary conflicts about deepening and widening, also won't lead to a good solution. So I think the best hope is that the review that the Commission has announced for next year might set in motion some discussions, and that this could be a starting point for even more. But so far, everything that we have heard out of the Council has been very, very muted and very, very, well, cautious, but not necessarily in a positive way.
Yeah, kind of going into the question that has been already touched upon, support from citizens, which is necessary both for enlargement and treaty reform. Here I've received multiple versions of the question, why is enlargement necessary, or why is treaty reform necessary? So I'm taking one specific question in connection to that. In my country, Denmark, this is from Jakob, we need a referendum, like is the case in many countries, to open or change the treaties. How can we convince the citizens that this is necessary, and how do we engage them in this debate?
Well, by talking about it. I mean, the main problem about institutional reform is that there is so little discussion about it that the moment you say institutions, a lot of people immediately stop listening. And of course, it's difficult. I also understand that it is difficult for policymakers to get out and start to talk about it when they know that nobody wants to listen to that. It's difficult for the media to put these issues on the front page when they know that they are going to sell less newspapers if this is on the front page and not something about Putin. So it's difficult, but it's necessary to start this debate, because in the end there are good arguments. And with good arguments, you can win a public discussion. You just have to lead it. And of course, there was an attempt, especially by the European Parliament, to launch a discussion with the Conference on the Future of Europe 2-3 years ago. Unfortunately, this conference was basically boycotted by the Council. There were too many governments who made clear from the beginning that they did not expect anything to come out of it, who insisted mostly that this was not the start of a treaty reform process. So again, the media thought, why should we write about it if this is probably not leading to anything? And then the result of that was that there was no broad debate about it, that this Conference on the Future of Europe was basically invisible to most citizens. And then it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because, of course, nothing came out of it if nobody talked about it. So it is difficult to start these debates, but it is necessary, and with the current sense of urgency, which we did not have with the Conference on the Future of Europe, at least not at the beginning, because it started before the attack on Ukraine, or at least the full invasion of Ukraine. Now it is clear that there is this sense of urgency with regard to enlargement, and institutional reforms, as I mentioned before, are connected to enlargement. So I think this is a good moment to get out and start this public debate.
Well, the sense of urgency should have been there at latest after Crimea. So now we are pants down.
Yes, thank you. I will take the next question here. So, see if I can now it's moving weird. But the question is, it's disappeared from the screen, but apologies for that. Technology isn't my friend today, but it was about also arguing towards the citizens why enlargement is necessary. The person asking the question is seeing or is concerned about if this enlargement will create additional risks to our EU institutions and also will lead to fragmentation of European interests. How do you see this concern? Why is enlargement necessary? Mr. Lipponen, if you want to start.
Well, enlargement, of course, is necessary, but we cannot neglect all the problems with the candidate countries. Did I mention yesterday that Tony Barber in the Financial Times has been writing repeatedly on the problems of nationalism, what's it about Kosovo, not to speak of Ukraine. So we cannot neglect explaining also these problems. It's too much now weighted on the enlargement. The Prime Minister yesterday didn't speak about anything else than enlargement. So it's a way of misleading the citizens in Europe, not to talk about the real problems, which are serious.
Thank you. And Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I think there are several arguments in favor of enlargement. One is, in a very general way, if we think that it is good to have the European Union with its supranational institutions instead of a purely diplomatic system, then a priori it is a good thing to have more countries within the supranational system. Of course, this is a very basic argument, which then has to be qualified a lot, because if enlargement means that the supranational system doesn't work anymore, then it becomes a problem. But a priori, it is good to have more member states in. And then specifically talking about the member states, I agree that there are a lot of problems in these candidate countries, and that it is necessary to talk openly about these problems. But of course, we have also seen that historically, with all the enlargement rounds, enlargement has been a positive factor to influence, for example, the democratic development of a country. It started in Spain and Portugal and Greece. It went on with the Central and Eastern European countries that joined after 1990. In all of these countries, the perspective of joining the European Union helped to make the country more democratic, to modernize it, and so on. Right now, we have seen, especially on the Western Balkans, the problem that when the enlargement process takes too long, at a certain moment it loses its credibility. And we see that anti-democratic actors in these countries are getting more successful because they say, well, the European Union doesn't give us a credible perspective of joining. The European Union only talks about enlargement, but it doesn't do it. And when the citizens in these countries start to lose trust in the European Union, that's bad for the European Union. So at some point, we need to get real about enlargement. This does not mean that we should ignore the problems. On the contrary, it means that we should talk very clearly with the governments of these countries about the reforms that they need to implement in order to join the European Union. But when they make progress, it also means that we must be open to them, that we must prepare to accept them in order not to lose credibility, and from a geopolitical perspective also in order not to let other authoritarian actors influence these countries.
Thank you.
Okay,
but,
final point. So this again means that we must be ready to accept them. We must be open to them, and that means that we must do the institutional reforms that we need to be ready for that.
Yeah.
Time to get tough with them, and also take care that the United States is not interfering all the time.
Thank you so much.
And they are not interested in making the European Union stronger.
Thank you. With that, I thank you both for a lovely debate. Also, our audience for listening, both online and here physically in place in Turku. I'm happy that we're having this discussion, especially here in Turku. Of course, we hope to continue these discussions over the next end of the day and tomorrow. We have a group of young federalists from across the Nordics and Baltics here with us. So I hope we can continue debating and discussing this over the next days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.